welcome to our discussion about the upcoming US election. I'm not the host today. I'm Eliam Sheikh. I work at LAJF, and I will just be doing some housekeeping. I think I've seen some of you before. Lovely to see you again. And while we wait for other people to join, if you've joined us before, you may know this already, but I'd love to hear from a few people to see where they're calling from and why they've joined us today. So I'll try to pick someone I haven't met yet. Martine, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Martina Visser. I was camper. I'm from the Netherlands.
Hi.
Hi, Carrie.
So lovely to see you.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you, Martina. How about, let's see, Hugo Vonken. Would you like to say hi?
Yeah, my name is Hugo Vonken. Yes, so I was a camper in '92 and I come from the Netherlands too. And I'm very excited to hear how the US election is covered by the Americans themselves. In our news, we see a lot about all the actual facts. So I'm interested to get to know more inside information.
Fantastic, thank you. And how about you, Pana? I do know you. You're my camper, but it'd be great to hear your voice. Pana, would you like to say hi and tell us where you're calling from and why you've joined?
Hi, I'm Panna. I'm from Hungary, and well, I would just like to learn more about the U.S. election, I guess.
And when did you go to camp?
Last year in 2019.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's see, one more person, and then we will get started. It's hard to pick. How about Francis?
I'm Francis. I'm from New Jersey, in the US, and I'm attending because my friends told me to, and I think it would be a good opportunity to learn more about the election, even though I can't vote. So, oh, and I attended camp in 2019.
Fantastic. Thank you all for saying hello, and thank you all for joining us. As I was saying, my name's Eliam and I work at LAJF, and it is our pleasure to have you all here today. I will just be telling you some Zoom housekeeping notes. Please keep yourselves muted while the session takes place so that we don't have interference. We will be recording this session, and so if you'd rather not have your face be made public in the future, you're very welcome to turn your camera off, although we'd love to see you. If you fall off of the call, you can use the same link to join us and we'll let you in. And we will be using the chat function to share questions today, and you can find the chat by hovering your mouse over the screen and going to the bottom, and there's something that says chat, or you can find 3 dots and navigate from there. And that is all from me now. I'm very pleased to have Elizabeth Lee, who went to camp in 2004, host this session, and over to you, Elizabeth.
Great, thank you, Eliam. Okay, so transitioning, monitoring the waiting room to you. Welcome, everyone. First, I want to thank you for making time on Saturday morning to be here with us. I also want to thank our esteemed panelists for also, donating their morning to us to talk about the U.S. elections. But obviously we wouldn't be here without Eliam, so thank you also for organizing that and managing the waiting room for us. As you guys have probably seen and heard, it would be an understatement to say that this American presidential election in 2020 has been very interesting and unprecedented. But that's why we have these experts to help us kind of think through and digest and think about where this election also takes us, right? Just want to note that, you know, as many folks have mentioned, we have an international audience here. So we'll, you know, we'll try to be inclusive of everyone and conscious of, you know, cultural customs, etc. But we do apologize ahead of time that this will be pretty American centric. And then with that caveat, I will let the panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Alan Lichtman. I was, believe it or not, at camp in 1962. It's hard to believe. It was almost 60 years ago. I was doing a very amateurish Mark Antony in the camp play. That was, of course, in the bad old days when camp was all male, but it was also in the good old days when Freddie was still the janitor. I am the co-creator of a system for predicting the results of American presidential elections, the keys to the White House, and I'm currently Distinguished Professor of History at American University in Washington, D.C. The keys to the White House has been correct in predicting the outcomes of American presidential elections since I first predicted the re-election of Ronald Reagan in April 1982 during what was then the worst recession since the Great Depression. Now, you may think it's a wonderful thing to be correctly forecasting presidential elections for nigh on 40 years. But I have to tell you a secret. All I succeed in doing every 4 years is making half of the country really, really mad at me. And I've been doing it so long that the entire country is really, really mad at me. And you can imagine, when I predicted Donald Trump's win in 2016, that did not make me very popular in 90% Democratic Washington, D.C., where I teach at American University. Now, because I'm a professor, I've got to give you a pop quiz, but it's a really easy one you don't have to answer. How many of you have read, seen, or heard anything about this year's presidential election? Of course you have. And my advice is to follow what the great British philosopher David Hume said: consign all that material to the flames, because conventional polling, conventional punditry, conventional commentary has nothing whatsoever to do with the underlying dynamics of how presidential elections really work, and will lead you astray, like it did in 2016. As you can see, I'm not a very sardonic person, but I did take some sardonic pleasure on election night 2016, watching all the pundits, who are, by the way, friends of mine, twist themselves into pretzels trying to explain why something happened that they had all assured us could not possibly happen. The keys to the White House are an alternative to conventional poll-driven, media-driven political commentary. The keys to the White House are premised on the essential insight that American presidential elections are votes up or down by a pragmatic electorate on the strength and performance of the party holding the White House. In other words, it is, imagine this, governing, not campaigning, that counts. And because the keys probe the underlying dynamics of an election and are not driven by polls, they sometimes can fall into place years before an election. Remember, I predicted 1984 and 1982. I predicted 2008 and 2006. In fact, I became notorious for saying things are going so badly on the fundamentals, which the keys probe, for the Bush administration, that the Democrats could pick a name out of the phone book and elect that person president. And that's kind of what they did, of course. Whoever heard of Barack Obama back then? And I called the hard-to-call 2012 election in 2010, which sparked the outrage of the poll compiler Nate Silver, who wrote a 20-page attack on my prediction, saying, you cannot possibly predict this early. And of course you can't, based on the polls, because the polls are meaningless, but you can on a system like mine that probes the underlying dynamics of an election. And ultimately, 2 years later, Nate Silver came around to my point of view that Obama would win. And I wrote him an email saying, let's write a joint article on how two totally different methods yielded the same result. Never heard a word from the guy. Now, I'd love to tell you that I came up with the keys by long and deep and brilliant contemplation. But were I to tell you that, to quote the late, not so great Richard Nixon, that would be wrong. I came across the keys totally by accident when in 1981, I was a distinguished visiting professor at Caltech in Pasadena. And there I met the world's leading authority in earthquake prediction, Vladimir Kailas-Borak from Moscow, one of only about a dozen worldwide scientists who are members of both the US and Soviet National Academies of Sciences. And he said, we are going to collaborate. And being very foresightful, I said, no, we're not. Earthquakes may be a big deal here in Southern California. I got to go back to Washington. Nobody cares about earthquakes there. And he said, oh no, I don't want to collaborate on earthquakes. I already solved that, right? Get this. He said, in 1963, he was a member of the Soviet scientific delegation that came to Washington under President Kennedy and negotiated by far the most important treaty in the history of the world, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty that kept us from poisoning our atmosphere, our oceans, and our soil. And he said, in Washington, I fell in love with politics, and I always wanted to use the methods of earthquake prediction to predict elections. But he said, look, I have a problem. I live in the Soviet Union. Elections, forget it. It's supreme leader or off with your head. But he said, you are an expert in American history, politics, and the presidency. At this point, I thought the guy was probably KGB, back when there was a KGB, but I'm an historian, I write about dead people, I have no secrets. So we indeed collaborated, and our collaboration was based on two insights. One, to reconceptualize presidential elections in earthquake geophysical terms. Remember, this is 81. Not as Carter versus Reagan, not as liberal versus conservative, not as Republican versus Democrat, but as stability, the White House party stays in power, and earthquake, the White House party loses power. And the second insight was to look at the big picture of incumbent party strength and performance, and not try to assess the day-to-day events of the campaign, the speeches, the debates, the fundraising, and the ads. And with those two insights, we looked at every election from 1860 in the horse and buggy days when Abraham Lincoln was elected to 1980 when Reagan was elected. And using Kailas-Borak's methods of pattern recognition, we came up with 13 key factors that could distinguish between stability and earthquake, and our simple decision rule that if 6 or more of those factors go against the White House party, they are predicted losers. Now, here's a big lesson. What do two academics do when they make a huge discovery like this? That the same set of keys could account for every election from 1860 to 1980. You publish it in an academic journal where you expect at least 4 or 5 people to read it. And that's what we did. We published it in the United States National Academy of Sciences Proceedings. Well, it turned out 6 people read the article, and the 6th person was the science reporter for the Associated Press. And he published an article which said, odd couple discovers keys to the White House. Well, it wasn't Felix and Oscar. It had to be the Soviet geophysicist and the US historian. And I'm thinking, wow, I can go pop with this. And I sent my stuff to the editor of the Washingtonian magazine, who immediately saw it was math and sent it down to his most junior editor, who calls me and says, Professor Lichtman, it's Ken DeSalle from the Washingtonian. I didn't understand one word of that article you wrote with the crazy Russian guy, But are you telling me you can predict who's going to be the next president? This is 1982, the beginning, more than 2.5 years ahead of time. And I knew if I gave him the proper academic answer, probability, caveat, margin of error, my pop career would be over in 10 seconds. So I swallowed real hard and I said, yes, I can. And that led to my April 1982 Washingtonian prediction of a Ronald Reagan re-election, which also led to another phone call. Gentleman calls me and says, this is Lee Atwater calling, political director of the Ronald Reagan White House. We want you to come to the White House. And I said, well, Mr. Atwater, with all due respect, you probably got the wrong guy. I like George. He said, no, we know who you are. So I go to the White House, spend the whole day there. And at the end of the day, Lee Atwater looks me in the eye and says, this was the real reason he got me there. What would happen, Professor Lichtman, if Ronald Reagan didn't run again? I'm thinking the damage, no, I'm gonna give it to you straight. Remember, 6 keys and you're out. Right now, you're down 3 keys and a sure win. But if Reagan doesn't run again, you lose the incumbency key, you lose the party contest key, because Bush and Kemp and Robertson will fight like crazy. That's 5. And without the Gipper, you lose the incumbent charisma key. George Bush is about as charismatic as a Passaic shopping center on a Sunday morning. Lee Atwater looks me in the eye, breathes a huge sigh of relief, and says, thank you so much, Professor Lichtman, and the rest is history. And there are several other times the keys intersected with history as well. But let's look at where the keys stand and what they now predict for 2020. And here's the story. At the end of 2019, Trump was looking pretty good. I hadn't made a final prediction, but he was down only 4 keys, 2 keys short of a predicted defeat. Then, as you know, everything changed in America with the pandemic and the cries for social and racial justice. And here's what happened. After the 2016 election, I get this note. You probably can see it there. It's on the copy of the Washington Post where I predicted Donald Trump's win. And it says, Professor, congrats, good call. And in big Sharpie letters, Donald J. Trump. Well, Trump acknowledged my prediction, but not being much of a reader, he didn't go more deeply to understand everything changes when you're the incumbent, not the challenger. When you're the incumbent, you're judged on your record. Remember, it's governing, not campaigning, that counts. Not understanding that, what Trump has done in his campaign and his presidency in 2020, more importantly, is revert to his 2016 playbook and try to talk his way out of the challenges posed by the pandemic and the demands for social and racial justice. Of course, that did not work. It didn't work for the country, and it didn't work for Donald Trump's reelection. The irony was, if he had focused on governing, he would have been in a much better position to get reelected, but he didn't understand that. And because he botched the response to the pandemic and to the need for social and racial justice, he lost 3 more keys. The short-term economic key, which is measured by an election year recession, the long-term economic key because of the sharply negative growth, and the social unrest key because of what is raging across the land. So he goes from 4 keys down to 7 keys down. And therefore, my final prediction was, which I issued in early August, that Donald Trump would become the first sitting president since Bill Clinton beat George H.W. Bush in 1992 to lose a re-election bid. Moreover, never in the history of the United States, my friends, has the party holding the White House suffered such a sudden and dramatic reversal of fortune in just a matter of a few months. It's never happened before. And because the keys are looking at the big picture of presidential performance, things like the midterm election results, third parties, long and short-term economy, scandals, social unrest, policy change, foreign policy successes and failures. They don't change quickly. And nothing that's happened since I made my prediction, even in all this chaotic election year, the Supreme Court nomination of Judge Barrett, Donald Trump catching COVID-19, the debate, the cancellation of the debate, none of this has moved a single key or changed any prediction. Let me close on a positive note. The keys to the White House are not just a system for explaining and predicting elections. They point to a whole new way of conducting presidential politics in the United States. The keys demonstrate that conventional campaigning, the debates, the speeches, the ads, the fundraising, the attacks, the dirty tricks, have no impact whatsoever, no predictive value in determining the outcome of an election. And if we could only get candidates, the media, the advisors to believe that, we could have a wholly different kind. I've been shouting this for 40 years, by the way. And if you want to ask me in the question period, I'll explain to you why I haven't gotten anywhere in 40 years. But I still put this out to all you influential folks out there, your former campers, friends, and spouses. We could have a campaign based upon building a mandate for governing. That is, candidates should tell us exactly what bills they're going to introduce in their first 100 days, what executive orders they are going to issue in their first 100 days. Give us your vision. Tell us the kind of persons you would put in your cabinet, in the White House, in the judiciary. Build grassroots support for this policy mandate. If you win, then you are in a much better position to govern. And if you govern well, your party is more likely to win the next election. And even if you lose, if you abandon the shallow, attack-driven, soundbite-driven campaigns and actually say something meaningful, you are more likely to be remembered, to make your mark on history, and even inspire the next generation of candidates who have been, if you look at the recent losing candidates, McCain, Romney, Kerry, nobody remembers a word of what they said except an occasional gaffe. But in fact, losing candidates, got to go back pretty far, who've expressed a vision, have made their mark on history. Barry Goldwater, the relentless conservative who was swamped by Lyndon Johnson in 1964. His meaningful conservative positions inspired the next generation of conservatives and led to the rise of Ronald Reagan. George McGovern in 1972 did the same thing for American liberals. So even if you lose, if you campaign according to the keys, you can make your mark on history and be an inspirational candidate. Imagine that. Losing can be powerful. So in closing, there is an old Chinese saying. Some say it's a blessing, some say it's a curse. May you live in interesting times. And I hope my little talk this morning has made your times a little bit more interesting and a little bit more informative. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Lichtman. All right, so before we go into our discussion portion, I want to let Carrie and Larry introduce themselves. Carrie, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks so much. And thanks so much, Professor Lichtman. That was really both fun to listen to and fascinating.
Thank you, Carrie.
Anyway, so pleased to be here with you. I want to thank Eliam for organizing this, and I want to thank Elizabeth for moderating it. And I am just as excited to hear from the other panelists as all of you. So thanks for joining us and taking time out of your Saturday to come listen to us talk about the election. It's amazing to see so many of you. And if there are any old friends in the audience, you're going to have to send me a message and say hi. I'm hoping there are. And just a quick note that it's been 30 years since I was at camp, in the summer of 1990 for the first time, and then the summer of 1991.
Wait a minute, looks like you're only 30.
It's an illusion. It's the soft light and the bad video. And the past couple of years have aged me enormously, I'm sorry to say. But I'm really thrilled to see people here, and I really appreciate that everyone's willing to spend more time talking about American politics at a time when really I think everybody is sick of it. And so thank you all for being here. Now, I am a senior reporter at the Center for Public Integrity. That's a nonprofit newsroom in Washington, D.C. And I've been in D.C. for over a decade, mostly covering what my editors like to describe very in sort of high-flying language as issues of democracy. So I am a longtime money and politics reporter. I started out as a baby lobbying reporter covering the lobbying industry and influence efforts. I moved into covering campaign finance around the time of Citizens United, which was a big landmark Supreme Court decision covering the influence of money in politics and how people found new ways to spend money to influence the outcomes of elections and the creation of policy. I covered also a lot of ethics and accountability issues. I've done congressional ethics, and of course in recent years have been as preoccupied as everybody else with the suddenly pressing questions of executive branch ethics that have been sitting on a shelf for a long time with no one really all that worried about them. I have covered foreign lobbying efforts. And the last couple of years, I have done a lot around access to voting and administration of elections, which gets me right into, I think, Larry Norden's sweet spot. And so I just want to stop here for a minute and say that you'll hear from him in a minute, but his work at the Brennan Center has been so helpful and so enormously fundamental to many of us who cover these issues in helping us understand them. And so as we all try to add to public understanding around elections, which has become politicized in an unprecedented way in the United States recently, I think that he is just going to be someone who we should all look to guide us through these difficult times. And so what I'll say is this year I have spent a lot of time writing about challenges in terms of access to the ballot for the last few years recently. And so I'm going to drop a link into the chat in a minute that links to some of our work on this election at the Center for Public Integrity in case people want to look at it. But we have done a lot on the movement and closure of polling places and how that affects people's access to the ballot. And we have also done a lot on other types of barriers that crop up. I spent some time before the 2018 election writing about Native American access to the ballot, which was under threat then in some really important ways. And I, for the first time in covering voting issues, find myself covering something that I feel able to voice a public opinion on in certain ways, limited ways, because reporters here don't talk a lot about opinions. But I do believe that everyone eligible should be able to vote. They should be able to do so safely. They should be able to do so conveniently, and they should be able to do so with dignity. We should be aware of who it's harder for and why it's harder for them. And there should be access to the ballot for those who are entitled to it. And people who can vote should vote. And so for the first time in a very long career reporting, I feel able to say that. And so I think it's important for reporters to be able to speak out about that kind of important issue. And so I will say, you know, I believe in that. I believe government should be transparent. I believe that all of my Freedom of Information Act requests should be fulfilled immediately with no redactions. There are certain values that I have as a reporter, but what I am not going to do is what Professor Lichtman did and tell you who is going to win the election. I'm going to leave that to him.
You're going to leave me hanging, not you, huh?
And I also will say that I love his keys. I love his spotless prediction record. But I do think that it matters who's able to vote and how easy it is for them. And I think that whether he's right or wrong, this election has just brought many surprises for us. And I'm looking forward to talking about that with all of you today. So I'm going to turn this over to Larry. And I will drop a link in the chat for those who want to see the type of work that we do at the Center for Public Integrity. And I also, in case people are friends with me on Facebook, I don't post a ton of work there. That's more of a personal space. I actually don't post a lot there at all. But I do tweet about our journalism at Levine Carrie on Twitter.
Well, thanks for those kind words, Carrie. First of all, I also want to thank Ellie and Elizabeth for putting this together, for moderating. And it's great to be on a panel with Professor Lichtman and Carrie. I'm huge fans of both of their work, and I've been lucky enough to, Carrie's, I think, interviewed me a couple of times, but been able to follow her career and to work with her occasionally. So I'm going to be kind of brief because I'd love to just get into the conversation. I'll just say a little bit about myself. I am the director of the Election Reform Program at the Brennan Center. The Brennan Center is a think tank and public interest law firm based at NYU Law School. They're about, kind of incredible. I've been there for 15 years, and it was a small operation when I started. There are about 120 of us now, lawyers and researchers and economists and others. Primarily in the democracy space, American democracy, we focus on American democracy. Our work is to do a lot of the things that Carrie talked about, to reduce barriers to voting, to increase participation, to make the American democratic process a fairer and more representative process. So my work, I direct our money and politics work, and that's how it's, I think initially, Carrie, we may have connected when you were writing about money and politics in the US, but I now also direct our work around election security and election administration. And I do want to open up to conversation. One thing I'll just mention, I just had a piece in Foreign Affairs, so I thought I would just briefly, because I know some of the issues that I covered in this piece are things that people are worried about. Basically, the point that I made in the article is that in some ways the American electoral system is more robust, although there's a lot of things where we need improvement on than some people are worried about going into 2020. So certainly I think if it's a very close election, we might have some problems, but assuming that the polls are roughly accurate right now, the things that people have been talking about, there's been a lot of, in American media reports, concerns about the president saying that he may not concede. It's really not up to him. So I'm not sure why that issue gets covered so much. He doesn't get to say whether or not he's lost. His concession is irrelevant. American elections are very decentralized. And one of the extraordinary things that I've seen this year is, and it's a bit odd that American elections are run at the county state level, often by partisans, by Republicans or Democrats, but Republican or Democrat, for the most part, particularly in the kind of key battleground states that we look at, those officials have been very resistant to pressure from the president talking about how he's worried about fraud and other things like that. So that has been very reassuring to me. And at the end of the day, those are the people that are going to certify election results. And at the Brennan Center, we've been doing a lot of work helping it's kind of an extraordinary circumstance because American elections are so decentralized. We've got 10,000 separate election jurisdictions. Making the adjustments that we've needed to make so that we can conduct an election during this COVID pandemic has really been incredible work. We seem to have made the adjustments for the most part, and maybe not everything I would have liked to have seen, that are to get us through this election. And something like 25 million Americans have already voted in this fall's election. The election is happening now. We often talk about election day, but it's actually happening now. Another concern that I spent a lot of time working on is potential cyber attacks against our elections. Our elections have become increasingly computerized, and the cyber threats have grown. And here again, there's been a lot of work done to make the American electoral system more resilient. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to avoid some of the nightmare scenarios that people have been very concerned about going into 2020. But I also do think there's potentially going to be a historic opportunity, and I'm happy to talk about this too, after this election to really reform American democracy. There's a lot of work, whether it's around money and politics, our redistricting process in this country, we're just improving access to the ballot. There's a lot that could be done in the American system. I think it's time for a reboot. And I do think, depending on how this election goes, there is the potential for that to happen. The House, the first bill it passed in the last Congress, H.R. 1, was a dramatic democracy reform bill. And all of the Democrats in the House and Senate have signed on to that bill. There is a chance in January of 2020 that may be one of the first things that a new administration and a new Congress move on. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to open up to conversation. Oh, and I do also want to say, which I meant to say at the beginning, it's great to see so many people from Camp Rising Sun. And I was a camper in '87 and '88, and there are a few folks, and I'm sure I'm missing some. I see Ling Hai and Jens and Johnny Reinhardt. So great to see all of you, and it's really I'm so grateful to be part of this community and see so many of you.
By the way, Larry's piece is great. I really recommend it to all of you.
Thanks. I'll put it in the chat.
So do I get to ask questions?
Yeah, go for it.
I think what I'd love, Larry, since you brought up HR 1, I wonder if everyone knows what that is. And the other thing that I will say, and so I'm going to quickly give the cheap answer to that and let Larry give the expensive, nuanced answer to that. But it's essentially a reform bill, a democracy reform bill by House Democrats that addresses a whole lot of ethics and voting issues. And one question that it was, I think in Washington, what was known as something of a messaging bill, because when Democrats passed it, everyone was aware that it really didn't have a substantial chance of getting through the Senate and being signed into law by the president at the time. But it included a package of reforms and was, I think, House Democrats' way of laying out an agenda for what they would do on these issues. And so as a reporter who remembers the post-Abramoff ethics reforms, the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act and all that, and has been kind of following how those have played out, which at the end of the day, there were some substantial changes that were made in the wake of the lobbying scandal, the Abramoff lobbying scandal, but there were some that then were sort of implemented in a very patchwork way or with a lot of regulatory holes or were easy to get around and were not as substantial as people had hoped. I think what I'd say is, you know, do you and Professor Lichtman have a take on the changes that should be made? And since HR 1 was passed some time ago, how would you change it to incorporate the lessons of this election season?
Those are good questions, Carrie. So let me
asking for a living, Larry.
Let me first of all say what HR 1 is, and I full disclosure, the Brandon Center has spent a lot of time working on HR 1. So a lot of the things that we have really pushed are in that bill. And secondly, I don't want to suggest by any stretch of the imagination that it's a sure thing that all the provisions in HR 1 will get passed. But I do think the fact, I feel like saying it's a messaging bill, maybe a little bit dismissive of it. I think the Democrats intended to run on this bill and this reform of democracy. And you know, often when a party runs on something and they win, they generally do try to fulfill those promises. So I think you're right that once it's for real and they know that might actually become law, and it's very hard to get democracy reform passed because everybody that's an incumbent won on the old system. So making changes to that system is tough. But I do think there's going to be a lot of pressure on them to try to get a substantial amount of what is in HR 1 passed. So I'll just quickly say a few things that I think are really important that are in HR 1. The things that I would emphasize happen to overlap with Brennan Center priorities, but automatic voter registration. One of the most ridiculous things in the American electoral system is that unlike many other democracies, people aren't automatically registered. You have to register, you have to affirmatively take the step to register. when you turn 18 as a citizen. If you move, you have to change your registration. You have to, technically you should remove yourself from the registration wherever you move from, update it to your new location. And millions of Americans every year, forget to do that, or the system doesn't work. There are errors in the processing of people's names, and then they show up to the polls or want to vote and can't. And so this would just make it much easier. Everybody would be registered. It's the state's responsibility to do that. You would no longer have that as a barrier to voting. And that's probably the #1 barrier there is to voting in the United States. It would also kind of mandate which has kind of happened because of this pandemic, every state allowing for mail voting, no excuse for early voting. It would reform the redistricting process. Folks may know that even folks not from the US, that we have this often very gerrymandered redistricting process where you can have a state that votes 50-50, but all of the candidates end up being elected from one party, basically because the maps are redrawn in a way that favors one party, or most of them are from one party. So not very representative. It would create a public financing of election systems, so that for candidates who opted in, most of their money would be public money as opposed to the private money that we have that kind of runs our elections today. So those are probably some, and then there are a bunch of ethics and kind of rule of law items. Probably some will, I think in particular, those items might get added. If you're talking about like what new things might there be, like how it might be changed, I don't know, it might be a separate package or it might be part of HR1. I think a lot of the interference that we've seen from the Trump administration and kind of breaking of norms in the US, that things that we never thought we would see an administration do, might need to be put more firmly into law. So not interfering with government agencies that are supposed to be doing scientific work, or the Department of Justice, and telling the Department of Justice who they should be investigating. Those kinds of things might end up in HR1. So sorry, that was a very long-winded answer. Did I miss anything, Carrie?
Let me add something to that, if I may. First, a little bit of advertising. I actually wrote a book on voting rights called The Embattled Vote in America, from the founding to the present, Harvard University Press, in which I address all of these issues. I've also been an expert witness in 100, yes, 100, remember, I'm an old timer, camper 1992, voting rights and civil rights cases, including most of the big ones in places like North Carolina, Texas, Florida, California. And a couple of things I would add to that excellent presentation. We need an updating of the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, the Supreme Court, in a predictable 5-4 decision, gutted the Voting Rights Act by taking out the so-called preclearance provision that certain states and localities with a history of discrimination have to pre-clear changes in voting laws and rules with the Department of Justice. That's gone. And that's one of the reasons you see 5-hour lines in Georgia, because they closed down so many polling places and they restricted the number of voting machines. They wouldn't have been able to do that if the preclearance still had been in effect. So we absolutely need an updating of the Voting Rights Act, particularly to restore the preclearance. And the other thing I would add to supplement automatic registration is same-day registration. That is, you can register on the day you walk in to the polling place. A number of states already had that, and there has been no problem. I also want to say a word about voter fraud, because that seems to be the word of the day, right? The president is talking about all of this Democratic voter fraud, how they're rigging the election. 2 points. Number one, voting fraud as a general matter is vanishingly small in America. Even the Heritage Foundation and the National Republican Lawyers Association that set out to prove there's widespread voter fraud found almost nothing. In fact, the Lawyers Association shut down their website. The President's Commission, which was supposed to find all this voter fraud, shut down before it found anything. Secondly, to the extent there has been any at all widespread voter fraud, systematic voter fraud in America, it's been done by Republicans, not by Democrats. The most egregious example is the congressional district in North Carolina, where Republican operatives tampered with ballots. Half a dozen have been indicted, and the election was decertified. The first federal election to be certified in almost 100 years by a unanimous vote, Republicans and Democrats, of the North Carolina State Board of Elections, and the election was reheld. So this whole notion, the Democrats are trying to rig this election, they're engaging in all this voter fraud, is absolutely as phony as President Trump's claim that 85% of people who wear masks get COVID. If that were true, we'd have 120 million cases of COVID in America. So much nonsense is coming out of this White House and its enablers. It's incredible. I've been an historian for more than 50 years. And as an historian, I teach my students to be faithful to the evidence, to the reasoning, to the logic, to the analysis, and to see all of that trashed and destroyed is one of the most dispiriting aspects of current politics.
I'll just add that on the voter fraud point, the other thing that I've noticed is that it's really terribly hard to commit voter fraud and not get caught.
Yes.
So as a practical matter, obviously, as someone who spent just a lot of time, maybe not quite as much as Larry or Professor Lichtman, but a lot of time talking to local election officials, there's a lot of checks and difference. One of the hard things about American elections, and I think everyone's mentioned this, is how decentralized they are. And so I think it's worth pausing for a moment and really unpacking what that means in this context. What that means is that every state is different. So my husband actually is a reporter who covers tax policy, which is extraordinarily complicated. And we have sort of a running joke that aside from the fact that we're no fun at parties, a lot of conversations start with one of us asking the other one about some, how do you vote this way? Or how does, what's the law on this? And me saying, well, it depends, because it depends on the state. Or me asking some complicated tax question that's come up in the course of a campaign finance story or something, and him saying, well, it depends. And so I just did a project where I wanted to collect, to the point that the professor raised about polling place closures, I wanted to collect data on polling place locations for the 2012, 2014, 2016, and 2018 elections, so we could take a really granular look at who was affected by polling place closure and also polling place movement. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll call every state and get it. How hard could this be? So I called every state, and then in some states I had to call every county, because the states don't actually keep track of that. So in Texas, I wound up reaching out to 254 counties. And then in Minnesota, by the time I got through all the counties, in a couple of counties, I had to go down to townships. So in Wisconsin, there's something like 1,800 election jurisdictions just in Wisconsin. And so what that means in practice is that it's really hard to hack a national American election because no two places are doing things the same way. And it also means that it's really hard to write clearly about the rules governing elections and election administration because they're different everywhere. And I think that there's some exploiting of that going on by people who want to encourage the idea that American elections are rigged or there's fraud in American elections because they don't run the same everywhere. And so people from one state can sometimes hear about how another state does it and say, well, that's not right. And so much comes down to what the technology that's in use locally allows you to do, right? Whether a jurisdiction has technology that allows you to vote at any polling place or just at the one you're assigned to, because they have to be able to pull up the right ballot that has not just the presidential race, but the referendum that in order to be eligible to vote on that referendum, you have to live within the city borders. You have to be in the right school board district, right? You have to get a ballot with the right school board race on it. So there are jurisdictions that have thousands of different ballot configurations, and they have to make sure the voter's getting the right one so they don't vote in any race that they're eligible for. And the whole thing is actually super complicated. And so if you talk to election officials, you wind up having conversations like, oh yeah, but I have backup generators at all the polling places in case the power goes out. And we've talked to them and we've boosted the Wi-Fi so that the ballot marking, so that the iPads we use to check in voters can connect to the voter registration database in the cloud. And also there was that time that there was an earthquake and we had to move the polling place at the last minute. So I have backups and we need this many polling place workers, but I have a bunch of people in reserve in case some of them don't show up that morning. I mean, because if you think about it, an election is really a giant, complicated production with a lot of moving parts. And if it goes well, you will never know the name of your local election official, right? They're going to be anonymous forever. But if it goes badly, you will know who they are. And so, if you really think about how complicated this is, now think about pulling off voter fraud to the degree that would sway a presidential race. Think about all the ballot configurations you're going to have to fake. Think about all the envelopes that the absentee ballots come in. Think about the fact that they're different everywhere. Think about the fact that they're printed on specific kinds of paper, right? And so now think about what it really would involve to have voter fraud on a grand scale in the United States that tips the election. It is logistically, even for a foreign power, just really, frankly, difficult to do that without getting caught. And so, I think that is something that should bring everyone a lot of comfort, even though for someone like me who's trying to cover this on a national level across jurisdictions, it's frankly a giant pain sometimes.
Carrie, the Russians don't care about being caught.
Yeah, maybe not, but I mean, they care about being effective, right? And so you want those ballots to count if you're going to go to all the trouble of faking them. And it's really hard to do this on a grand scale. And so, I think that if you're really worried about it, you should probably relax a little. That's up to you. You don't have to. I mean, I know everyone's having a lot of fun anticipating the apocalypse, and I don't want to rain on anyone's parade or, again, not a ton of fun at parties. And, I cannot rule out for you that the apocalypse is coming or that, the world is ending or any of those things, or there's going to be a meteor that lands down the block. I mean, 2020 has been full of surprises. It's entirely possible that the election is going to lead to, I don't know, Ragnarok. But, in all honesty, there's a certain number of preventive measures that election officials are taking, and they have a real history of working. So I would say that one thing to do is, and people have talked a lot about the media as a monolith, which by the way, pet peeve. If you all would stop doing that, I'd be so, so grateful. So to some degree, my job as a reporter, I'm in a funny space where I work for a nonprofit newsroom and my work runs in a lot of publications. And part of my mission is to do the work at a kind of sophisticated level that's hard for a local newsroom to do. So one of the things I tend to do is be very nuanced about these things, which sometimes is not popular with editors who really would like the world to be ending because it makes for, frankly, a better headline. And so, one of the things I tend to say a lot is, okay, calm down, let's unpack this a little, right? Let's talk about the factors going into this. So there are going to be mistakes in this election. There already have been. People have been sent incorrect ballots. People have not been sent ballots. There have been long lines. There will be more of those things. But I think one thing that is not helpful is to conflate incompetence with evil, to suggest that something is systematic when it is systemic, or to overreact to, I don't know, 9 ballots being found in a dumpster that election officials actually found, retrieved, and corrected the mistake on in Pennsylvania. It was 9 ballots and they found them. That's great. They fixed it. They found them.
And it was a mistake, not fraud.
Right. And so, there's been a lot of talk about the president, and as a personal life choice, I try not to derail my day every single time he tweets about voting because, really a person would never get anything done. And I have a full-time job and 2 children and laundry. So, we all have to decide how we're going to handle this. But there was something I want to call your attention to, which is several months ago, there was a special election in a congressional district. It was California 25. And Larry, Professor Lichtman, you guys may remember this one, but it was a special election for a House seat. and it was competitive. And at the last minute, local election officials in Los Angeles County added an in-person voting site in Lancaster, California. They decided, you know, the mayor, who was a Republican, who actually is a lawyer who has tried voting rights cases, was annoyed because his district is kind of, it's out, you know, his town is outside of Los Angeles. It doesn't get a ton of attention within Los Angeles County. And he wanted an in-person voting site in his town for this special election. And so the election official said, oh, all right, fine, we'll add an in-person voting site. And the president came out because he wanted the Republican candidate to win and said, this election is rigged. Here they are. They're adding this in a place with a lot of Democrats. Meanwhile, the Republican mayor had asked for it. And we actually did a data analysis and found out that that was going to be the closest in-person voting option for 40% of the Black voters who lived in that district. And they were going to have to drive, if I'm recalling the story correctly, twice as far as other voters to get to an in-person polling site if they hadn't added the voting center. It probably should have been there all along. So we did a story that said, you know, I think the headline actually was, Trump says this election was rigged, you know, the data shows otherwise. And I think that's a little bit the way to handle it. You know, he says things and that's fine. You know, I am also from the outer boroughs of New York. I also sometimes just say things, but they're not always true. And sometimes you have to sort of unpack and explain why they are not true. So I will leave it at that.
Okay, so just to, I guess, move into questions. I think the key takeaway, right, is that the American election system is so decentralized that if anything happens, it's probably more incompetence than malice. But I do, so I think because, you know, we want to, you know, get the audience in on this. I do wanted to go in another direction. I know we've talked a lot about mechanics of voting, etc. But Carrie started talking a little bit about the media. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that because, right, like despite you know, our best efforts to have people, I guess, vote rationally, we know they don't vote rationally, right? And they probably don't, you know, look for, when they vote, they probably don't think about like a mandate for governing necessarily, right? And that's why we're kind of in the mess we are. We have to have presidential debates, et cetera, because politics is also theater. And so wanted to get your thoughts on how the media has treated this election versus 2016, and push back a little bit. I mean, I know I'm with Carrie that when we talk about the media, it is certainly not a monolith, but you know, the media like drives the narrative sometimes, right? Like when they find these ballots, right? Like some people spin it certain ways, and we can expect certain reporters, you know, to spin stories like this certain ways. And so would love your thoughts on whether the media is doing a better job this election cycle, and how, you know, we, the public, can also hold them accountable, right? Because, you know, we know some reporters are better than others as well.
So I'll take a quick crack at this without trying to be too broad brush about it. One thing I will say is, I think a lot of media outlets, I'll put it that way, have been pretty good about getting some critical information to the public. So one example I will give is there's a lot of concern among election officials and in the community that I work in that it's something called the blue shift or the red wash. I forgot what the different phrases are. But that in part because of so many comments that the president has been making, but also in part because of just patterns of voting that already existed, that you were going to have results where on election night, voting in person was going to be counted first, mail vote, and this is actually only true in a few states, but mail ballots would be counted later, and because so many more Democrats are voting by mail, and we saw this a little bit in 2018, frankly, the president would say, you know, I'm ahead now, even though Philadelphia says there's still hundreds of thousands of ballots to count. I'm going to declare victory. The networks might get behind him somehow. And then he would claim that there's cheating going on because over the course of counting votes over election night over the next couple of days, Democratic votes would come in and he would lose. I think the media has been quite good at relaying to people that this is going to be a different election than what we have seen in the past because of COVID, that voting patterns are very different in the United States this year. And if you look at polls, people get it. Like 2/3 of Americans assume that we're not going to have full election results on election night. I actually think that may be wrong. We may know on election night who has won, but I think the media has done a good job of laying the groundwork for people that this election is different and their expectations may need to be different. And that's been very helpful. And I would say the same thing on voter fraud, by the way. I think the media has been quite good on debunking a lot of Trump's statements about voter fraud. I don't know if Carrie or Professor Lichtman have anything to add to that.
I don't, I'm not really an expert who follows the day-to-day flows of the media, but I have to say, regardless of, and I have no problem with the media, by the way, none whatsoever. And my system goes back to when the media was openly partisan back in the 19th century. This idea of an impartial media is really a creation that starts in the 20th century. And the other thing, of course, my system is premised on the idea that there's enough information out there. If you don't know who Trump is and what he represents by now, you have been living in a cave for the last almost 4 years. So I don't think the problem is that people don't have enough information, don't have the right information. But what has changed as an historian, I can tell you, at least from the 20th century to the 21st century, is the bubbles that people live in. When Kennedy and Nixon debated, there were, 3 networks and 3 or 4 newspapers. Now there are hundreds of outlets that you can tune into and become part of a very tightly knit and like-minded group that just reinforces each other's prejudice. And that is a big change.
Yeah, I think a lot depends on where people get their information, and that's a really important point. Look, I'm going to admit to being a certain age and someone who still gets the print editions of minimum 2 newspapers every day. So I may not be your typical consumer of media. I think, there's a big difference between people who think in terms of print, people who think in terms of broadcast, people who think in terms of online kind of sound bites. And I will also say that, has the media done a perfect job writ large covering this election? Of course not. Of course not. I'm not going to say that reporters have. But I do think that reporters are trying really hard to put nuance and context around a lot of what they report, to put data around what they report. And I think that that's important. And look, let those among us who have not written a bad headline, sent a bad tweet, stand up. I'm not going to. And I am certainly not a media critic. But I think sometimes we're all making a lot of choices as we work between speed and completeness. I won't say between speed and accuracy, but between speed and making that other phone call, right? And I'm in a very luxurious position. I tend to have longer deadlines than most, and I can pick and choose my stories a little more. And so what I don't want to do is really sit there in my privileged position and second guess the daily reporters who have been on a hamster wheel for the entirety of this administration, just working incredibly hard to make sure that people know what they need to know. And uncovering it in the face of substantial and serious resistance to, I think, being transparent with the public about what the government is doing. And so reporters, daily reporters, are some of the hardest working, best meaning people that I know. And again, my social circle may not be like everyone else's, right? I'll freely admit that. But I think that everything they do, every mistake they make is out there in public for everyone to pull apart all the time. And if you think that's easy, think about how you'd feel about it. We're accountable and our name goes on it. And so I think it's really hard for the working reporters to do anything other than what they do, which is put a lot of context around the claims that people are making, fact check them to the best of their ability, and keep digging, right? I really want to say, and I'm sure people can come up with bad examples, but reporters are here to tell people the truth. You know, we're here because we want people to have the information that they need to make informed decisions. We're here because we're doing the best that we can. We're here because one story may not be perfect, but man, you get another shot tomorrow, and you keep building on it, and you keep doing the best you can, and you keep trying to put new information out there. And you also keep trying to translate for people what someone else's position is and why it's like that. And so I guess what I would say is, you know, be an informed consumer of it. You know, think about what you're reading, think about where you're getting your information. I think most people are getting it online now. Think about how it's coming to you. Think about whether you want to be more intentional in your choices about it. And so I would love to see people reward the reporters who do a good job by reading those complicated stories. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, that's fair. And also buy subscriptions, because a lot of local newspapers have folded, right, in the age of digital. And so, I mean, that's also like part of the problem, right?
Thank you for that.
Yeah, no, I mean, we need like a robust media for a healthy democracy. And so, I mean, I think some people have said, right, like the fact that local reporters can no longer report even on local races, right, is a detriment to all of us. So we have about 10 minutes left. I know there are a lot of questions that came in right now, and then there were also questions that came into LEM, you know, like weeks before. So I want to make sure we can kind of like cover everything. We talked about voting itself, media coverage. I think it's also really important to reflect on like this moment in history, and I think it's you know, it's great we have Professor Lichtman here, a historian, to also help us like contextualize what this election means for Americans and also like the rest of the world, right? So maybe we can end on that, and also talk a little bit about, there was a question about, you know, what I guess the future Justice Barrett would mean for the United States, but also like maybe the panelists could reflect on you know, how important this election is, right? Like a lot of folks have said, like this is probably one of the most important elections of our lifetimes. So would love your thoughts on why, especially, you know, reflecting on everything that's happened in 2020 with the pandemic, the uprisings across the country, you know, the inequities that have been surfaced, that have always been here, right? That the pandemic has exacerbated. Yeah, and I don't know if Professor Lichtman, you want to start?
You know, we do hear every 4 years, this is the most consequential election. And I can tell you from the perspective of an historian, that's really true this time. Let me just highlight a few of the critical things that are going to affect our future that are tied to this election. And I'm going to start with something that may be a little unexpected to some, and that is climate change. Climate change is an existential threat. As much as Mike Pence wanted to dodge that question in the vice presidential debate, it is an existential threat to our survival and well-being. It's not a theoretical concept anymore. It is here. The West is burning. The Southwest is caught in record droughts. Derechos and tornadoes are devastating the Midwest. Record storms are battering the South. Within 20 years, most of our coastal cities, unless we do something drastic, will be flooded. We have a president and an administration that not only is in denial about climate change, but that has rolled back virtually every regulation designed to deal with catastrophic climate change. And withdrawn us from the international effort. Without the US, the international effort is futile. So our very future as a planet may hinge on this election. Second critical point is the future of our democracy. Donald Trump has come as close as any president in history, and much more so, to trying to become an autocrat. Look who he admires around the world. It's not democratic leaders, it's dictators like Erdogan in Turkey, Xi in China, and most, of course, Putin in Russia. Just to hit a few critical points. He has said, of course, utterly falsely, that Article 2 of the Constitution gives him a right to do anything he wants as president. He has politicized the entire government, including the Department of Justice, to a degree never before seen in this country. He has destroyed checks and balances by stonewalling every congressional investigation, including an impeachment investigation where the powers of Congress are at their height. He has done everything in his power to torpedo the free press. So those who say democracy is on the ballot are absolutely right. You know, I'm not a naysayer. I'm not an alarmist, but I do think our democracy and our planet would not survive another 4 years of Donald Trump.
Thank you.
We've only got a couple minutes. I'll be quick. I also think this is an extremely consequential election. My focus is mostly on American democracy, so I can probably speak to that most and say that you know, I think if this election goes badly, and that could go badly in a number of ways, the American democratic project itself could be very threatened by that. To my mind, there's no question, first of all, that there needs to be some dramatic reforms to American democracy, and that I think that can probably only happen after the election. That, for the reasons that Professor Lichtman said, there are obviously what happens in the United States and who we choose for our leadership has great impacts on the world. I will say, you know, I've seen a number of questions about the Supreme Court. I think the United States is somewhat unique among democracies in how much power the Supreme Court has. I am concerned about a new Supreme Court and what that might mean for reforms to our democratic system. And I think we may need as a country to rethink the power that the Supreme Court has in the United States. I work with a lot of people who went into the law because of things that the courts accomplished in protecting minority rights, in moving toward a greater, more representative democracy. But the truth of the matter is, if you look at the history of the Supreme Court, and Professor Lichtman can probably speak to this, in general, in the history, with the exception of a few decades after World War II, it's actually been a fairly retrograde force, and in being anti-democratic and supporting corporate rights over human rights. There's a lot of resistance with a lot of people that I work to rethinking the role of the court because, you know, when I went to law school, it was all about the courts protecting rights and as being a check on a tyrannical majority. But I think in general, there's a problem in the amount of power that we invest in the courts, and that there's a danger in having lifetime appointments on the Supreme Court that can act basically as an anti-democratic, anti-majoritarian check on the will of the people. So I just think that's something that the United States is going to have to confront probably sooner rather than later, depending on how the court deals with a majority view that it may not be comfortable with.
I guess I will add to that by saying, of course, I agree, this is an incredibly important election. And I also agree that they all are, right? We should care about all the elections. But yes, this is, I think, a critical election for the path the country will take. And so my hope continues to be that everyone who is able to So forgive me for excluding our international friends on this call. I hope that everyone who is eligible to vote, has a plan to vote, is voting, and will make their voice heard, because I think that government really is at its best when it represents the will of people and the consent of the governed, right? So I hope that everyone makes their voice heard in this election and comes out for it. There are a lot of critical things. I also do think that we're heading towards, in the wake of this first or only Trump administration, however that shakes out, a national discussion about ethics in public life. And I think Larry flicked at this earlier, but it's something I've followed closely for a long time. There are a lot of stories that I've written about the ethics of public officials, in which the first question that I get very reasonably is, so what will happen to them because they violated this law? And the answer is typically very little, right? I've done reporting that led to no fewer than 2 cabinet officials being told that they weren't complying with their ethics agreement and with federal ethics law, and Wilbur Ross and Stephen Mnuchin are still in the cabinet. So I think one of the things that the country is going to have to decide is how to handle those situations going forward, and whether or not they want more teeth in ethics laws, more accountability and transparency from public officials. And I think too that in addition to what Larry said about a discussion over the role of the court and the proper place for the court in American life, there needs to be a renewed discussion of executive power. Because I think, well, you know, there's been an increasingly muscular executive branch over the last few administrations. And I think everyone with this administration has really seen what a president can do with executive power. And Congress, in many ways, I think, has allowed some of their powers to atrophy in important and interesting ways, or has chosen not to exercise them, or there's some gray areas about what exactly they can do. And so I think checks and balances is sort of a cornerstone of American life, and everyone needs to think a little more about what that means and what they want it to mean going forward. And I think that that's a discussion that's happening around us, and I look forward to covering it.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so everyone, we're at time. I hear from Eliam that she is open to organizing a follow-up conversation to this. So watch out for that, because it seems like, you know, a lot of folks are really interested in the question of the popular vote versus the electoral college, and other parts of this, right? And winner take all. So stay tuned for that, because it seems like there's a lot of interest. I do want to just close by saying, you know, we've talked a lot about, you know, reining in the executive branch, maybe passing HR 1 to enact a bunch of voter reforms, redistricting reforms, et cetera. As someone who works in the legislative branch, right, in my day job, you know, I would just want to remind folks, right, that especially, you know, our American friends, right, that you have the power to elect your leaders, and you have the ability, right, to choose what kind of reforms that you know, you think we need, and that means like choosing people who are going to be willing to speak truth to power, right? HR 1 is was very aspirational, right? And seeing like the inside baseball, we knew that a lot of the Democrats who voted for this had to also make concessions, right? Because like Larry said, the people who are in power now became in power with like the rules that we currently have, right? So, you know, any reforms that happen will have to come as a compromise, which is not to say that, you know, electoral reform is an impossible dream, but you know, I think us as an engaged and informed public have to also recognize that we need to hold our leaders accountable, and if we truly want electoral reform, et cetera, that means going to the ballot box and like selecting the right people, right? And also thinking about adding in new leaders, right? There are members of Congress who've been in office for decades, and some people who inherited in some ways, you know, their position from, you know, their parents, or from their family, right? So lots of things to think about. I want to thank our panel for starting this discussion, and thank everybody for joining us on this Saturday morning. If you're interested in this, which seems like there's more interest, I think LEM will follow up with a series of discussions. We're less than 20 days out from the election, but we can have this conversation, and I think even after the election, right? Like when we talk about electoral reform, making sure that people have the ability to vote, that's stuff that can also happen after the election, right? And it's also something that we shouldn't just talk about every 4 years. So thank you, and thanks for all of the question and interest. I don't know if LEM, you wanted to say anything?
Thank you so much to our panelists and to you, Elizabeth, and to everyone for having joined us. I am not sure what form the continuation of the conversation will take, but it is definitely exciting to see that people are interested, and I'm sure that we will find ways to connect and to perhaps find answers to some of the questions. I just wanted to plug that we are celebrating our 90th anniversary at LHF and at CRS, and there will be a virtual gala next Sunday. I'll drop the link in the chat, and it'd be lovely to see you all there in a more relaxed and less political atmosphere. Thank you all so much for coming today, and have a wonderful day.